She couldn't breathe. At least, that's what they said. In a dimly lit room somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, a woman lay on a wooden bed, gasping for air. Her chest felt tight, her throat burned, her body trembled without warning. Sometimes she would faint, sometimes she would scream, sometimes she would simply collapse into silence. The physicians gathered around her believed they understood exactly what was happening. Her womb was rising, not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. For centuries, some of the most respected medical authorities in the ancient world taught that a woman's uterus could detach itself and wander freely through her body. It could drift upward toward her lungs. It could press against her heart. It could suffocate her from the inside. And when it moved too high, they believed it caused choking, hysteria, madness, even death. This was not folklore whispered in village markets. This was medicine. Much of this theory is often traced back to the teachings associated with Hippocrates, the man widely referred to as the father of medicine, in texts attributed to him and his followers. The female body was described as fundamentally different from the male body, wetter, colder, more porous, and dangerously unstable. The womb, in particular, was seen as unpredictable. Ancient physicians imagined it almost like a living creature inside the woman, capable of movement, capable of desire, capable of anger. If deprived of sexual activity or pregnancy, they believed it could become restless, frustrated, even vengeful. A dissatisfied uterus, they argued, would begin to roam, and if it traveled upward, the consequences could be catastrophic. This condition was called hysteria, the Greek word for uterus. From it, centuries later, would come the term hysteria. But in its earliest form, hysteria was not considered psychological. It was anatomical. Imagine the implications of that belief. If a woman experienced anxiety, dizziness, shortness of breath, paralysis, seizures, or emotional outbursts, the explanation was already prepared. The womb had shifted. If she fainted during stress, the womb had risen. If she resisted marriage, the womb was misbehaving. The diagnosis was not only medical, it was moral. Treatments followed accordingly. To coax the womb back down, physicians recommended sweet-smelling substances placed near the vagina to lure it downward, and foul odors held near the nose to drive it away from the chest. Fragrance as gravity, scent as medicine. Marriage was often prescribed as a cure. Pregnancy, too. Regular sexual intercourse was seen as stabilizing, a way to keep the uterus satisfied and anchored in its proper place. In other words, the treatment for many female ailments was male control. And yet, within the worldview of ancient medicine, this made sense. The body, according to Greek medical theory, operated through balances, hot and cold, wet and dry, tension and release. The male body was considered naturally balanced. The female body, however, was seen as inherently unstable, requiring regulation. The wandering womb was not an isolated idea. It fed into a larger philosophy about women's nature, emotional, irrational, physically incomplete. Centuries later, the philosopher Aristotle would argue that the female was essentially a misbegotten male, a body that had not fully realized its potential form. Women were colder, he claimed, less perfect, more passive. Within such a framework, the idea of a restless internal organ did not seem absurd. It seemed logical. But here is the uncomfortable truth. No one had ever actually seen a wandering uterus. There were no dissections of living bodies, no imaging technologies, no anatomical evidence that the uterus could travel through the thoracic cavity like smoke in a jar. The theory survived because it explained what men did not understand, and because it reinforced what society already believed. The woman on the bed, the one who couldn't breathe, may have been experiencing panic, epilepsy, trauma, hormonal shifts, or grief. But her suffering was filtered through a cultural lens that insisted her body was to blame. Not the world around her, not the expectations placed upon her. Her body, and that idea would last for nearly 2,000 years. In the next part, we will enter the world that created this theory, a world obsessed with balance, purity, and control, and discover why the wandering womb was not seen as madness, but as science. To understand why the wandering womb was taken seriously, we have to step inside the ancient imagination. Ancient Greek medicine did not operate the way modern medicine does. There were no microscopes, no germ theory, no understanding of hormones or the nervous system. Instead, health was explained through balance, an elegant and deceptively simple framework known as the theory of the four humors. According to this model, the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each corresponded to qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and to elements: air, water, fire, earth. Illness was not caused by bacteria or trauma but by imbalance. Too much heat, disease. Too much moisture, disease. Improper flow, disease. Within this system, men and women were not considered biologically equal variations of the same design. They were fundamentally different constructions. Men were thought to be hotter and drier. Women were colder and wetter. Heat, in ancient physiology, was associated with strength, activity, rationality, and perfection. Coldness was linked to passivity, softness, and incompleteness. This is where medicine blended seamlessly with philosophy. Aristotle reinforced these ideas by arguing that biological sex reflected metaphysical hierarchy. In his view, the male body represented the fully realized form of humanity. The female body was a deviation, not defective in a moral sense, but incomplete in a natural one. If heat perfected the body, and women lacked sufficient heat, then their physiology must be less stable. Their organs must behave differently. Their bodies must require guidance. The uterus, or hystera, became central to this worldview. Unlike most internal organs, the uterus had no obvious counterpart in men. It was mysterious, invisible, powerful. It was associated with reproduction, but its broader function was poorly understood. And in the absence of anatomical clarity, imagination filled the gaps. Ancient texts described the womb as an independent, almost animal-like entity. Some writers compared it to a living creature inside the woman, capable of movement and driven by a desire for moisture and reproduction. If deprived of pregnancy, it could dry out. If dried out, it could become lighter. And if lighter, it could rise. In a world governed by the logic of elements, this reasoning did not seem irrational. Dry things rise. Smoke rises. Vapor rises. Why not the womb? In medical writings attributed to Hippocrates and his school, symptoms such as suffocation, dizziness, anxiety, and convulsions were attributed to uterine displacement. The condition we might now interpret as panic disorder or neurological illness was reinterpreted as mechanical migration. What's striking is how systematic these explanations were. The womb did not move randomly. It responded to environmental conditions. If a woman remained unmarried for too long, her womb could become restless. If she experienced sexual frustration, it could dry and drift. If she inhaled certain vapors, it might recoil or advance. In this model, female suffering was not meaningless chaos. It was predictable. It followed rules. But those rules always pointed back to one conclusion. The female body required management. Marriage was not just a social institution. It was a medical solution. Pregnancy was not only reproduction. It was stabilization. Sexual access was framed not as dominance but as therapeutic necessity. And here, medicine became a quiet enforcer of social order. Because if the womb wandered when deprived of male contact, then restricting women's autonomy could be justified as protective, even compassionate. This belief system was not malicious in its origin. It was built from observation filtered through cultural assumption. Ancient physicians truly believed they were helping, but their help was shaped by the limits of their worldview. There was another reason the wandering womb persisted. Women's bodies were rarely dissected. Human dissection in ancient Greece was limited and controversial. In some periods and regions, it was forbidden. In others, it was rare. Knowledge of internal anatomy came largely from animal dissection, inference, and theoretical speculation. The uterus was hidden, untouched, shielded by taboo. Without direct anatomical study, myths could flourish unchecked. When women described internal sensations, fluttering, pressure, cramps, breathlessness, those experiences were interpreted through existing theory. And existing theory insisted the womb was mobile. In many cases, women themselves may have accepted these explanations. When authority speaks with certainty, doubt becomes difficult. Imagine living in a world where your body was described as fundamentally unstable, where emotional intensity or resistance could be reclassified as organ malfunction. Over time, the idea would sink in. You would learn to interpret your own pain through the language available to you. And that language was uterine. But something else was happening beneath the surface. While Greek physicians debated balance and movement, other cultures developed their own frameworks for understanding female health. Some were equally restrictive. Others were more pragmatic. Yet the Greek model, refined, written down, philosophically justified, would become the foundation of Western medicine. And with it, the wandering womb would travel far beyond the Mediterranean. It would survive the fall of empires. It would pass into Roman texts, It would be absorbed into medieval theology. It would evolve into something even more powerful than a moving organ. It would become a diagnosis. In the next part, we'll see how the wandering womb transformed from anatomical theory into a moral judgment, and how the word hysteria began its long, dangerous life. The Roman Empire fell. Libraries burned. Philosophers were replaced by theologians, but the womb kept wandering. Greek medical texts did not disappear with antiquity. They were copied, translated, preserved, first by Roman scholars, later by Islamic physicians, and eventually reintroduced into medieval Europe. The authority of ancient thinkers remained largely unquestioned, and with that authority came the hysteria. As Christianity reshaped Europe, medicine did not vanish, it merged with theology. The body was no longer just a system of humors. It became a vessel of morality. Illness could now reflect spiritual disorder, and the female body, already seen as unstable, fit uneasily into this new moral universe. The concept of hysteria began to shift. The wandering womb remained a physiological explanation, but increasingly, female suffering was interpreted through both medical and spiritual lenses. If a woman convulsed, screamed, or claimed to see visions, was it her uterus, or was it something darker? In medieval Europe, these categories were not clearly separated. A woman experiencing seizures might be treated with herbal fumigations to reposition the womb, or she might be prayed over to expel demons, sometimes both. Medical knowledge during the Middle Ages was still heavily influenced by ancient authorities, including Hippocrates and later Roman physicians like Galen. Galen, in particular, reinforced the idea that female reproductive organs were analogous to male ones but inverted inward. Due to lesser heat, in this model, the uterus remained central to female pathology, but something subtle had changed. In antiquity, the wandering womb was a mechanical problem, imbalance, dryness, displacement. In the medieval world, it began to carry moral weight. A woman who was too loud, too emotional, too resistant, her body could be blamed. If she refused marriage, perhaps her womb would rebel. If she challenged authority, perhaps her suffering was divine punishment. The word hysteria would not fully solidify into its modern psychiatric meaning for centuries, but its roots were growing deeper, and the social consequences were profound. Women were increasingly confined to rigid roles: virgin, wife, mother, nun. Their bodies were monitored not just for health, but for obedience. The idea that their physiology was inherently unstable made restriction appear reasonable. Control was framed as care. This is where medicine and power intertwine most clearly. When a culture believes that a woman's internal organ can sabotage her rationality, then limiting her legal rights, education, and autonomy becomes easier to justify. It is not oppression, the logic goes. It is protection from her own biology. By the late medieval period, universities in Europe began formalizing medical education. Texts by ancient authorities were studied as unquestionable truth. Dissection slowly returned in certain cities, but it was rare and often performed on male bodies. The female interior remained mysterious. Anatomical illustrations from the period reveal more imagination than observation. The uterus was drawn symbolically, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes abstract. Reality remained hidden beneath assumption. But change was coming. The Renaissance would reawaken curiosity about the human body. Artists and physicians would begin cutting open corpses in pursuit of truth rather than tradition. One of the most significant figures in this transformation was Andreas Vesalius. In 1543, Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, a groundbreaking anatomical work based on direct human dissection. For the first time in centuries, anatomy was being corrected through observation rather than inherited authority. And when bodies were opened, carefully, systematically, something became clear. The uterus did not wander. It was anchored by ligaments. It was not floating freely through the torso. It was not climbing toward the lungs. The mechanical foundation of the wandering womb theory began to crack. But here is the paradox. Even as anatomy improved, the diagnosis of hysteria did not disappear. It evolved. Instead of a physical organ moving through the body, hysteria became something more abstract. A nervous disorder, an emotional excess, a uniquely female fragility. The location shifted. The blame remained. Women continued to be disproportionately diagnosed with conditions linked to emotional instability. Their pain was still filtered through centuries of inherited suspicion about their biology. The wandering womb was dying as anatomy. It was being reborn as psychology. And that transformation would reach its most extreme form in the 18th and 19th centuries. when hysteria became one of the most common medical diagnoses for women in Europe and America. In the next part, we will enter that world, a world of fainting couches, asylums, and clinical demonstrations where the ghost of the wandering womb still haunted medicine, even after it had been anatomically disproven. By the 18th century, the womb had stopped wandering, at least anatomically. Medical textbooks no longer seriously argued that the uterus floated through the torso like vapor. Dissection had made that impossible to defend. Ligaments were visible, structure was undeniable, and yet, women were still collapsing. They were still fainting, trembling, convulsing, weeping uncontrollably, reporting mysterious pains, paralysis, choking sensations, racing hearts. The symptoms had not vanished, only the explanation had shifted. Hysteria, once tied directly to the uterus, slowly migrated upward, from the pelvis to the nerves, from the womb to the brain. The Enlightenment had ushered in new confidence in reason and science, but it had not erased old assumptions about women's nature. Women were still widely described as more emotional, more delicate, more susceptible to nervous disturbance. The language changed, the hierarchy did not. By the 19th century, hysteria had become one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions among women in Europe and the United States. It was astonishingly flexible as a label. A woman could be diagnosed with hysteria for insomnia, anxiety, irritability, sexual desire, lack of sexual desire, ambition, defiance, depression, chronic pain, or grief. Almost any behavior that deviated from expectation could be medicalized. In Paris, at the Salpêtrière Hospital, the neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot conducted public demonstrations of female hysterics. Women diagnosed with hysteria were displayed before audiences of physicians and students. Under hypnosis, they convulsed dramatically, arched their backs, froze into rigid poses. These episodes were photographed, catalogued, studied. Charcot believed hysteria was a legitimate neurological disorder, not mere theatrics. Yet the patients were overwhelmingly female, and their symptoms often mirrored the expectations of the era. Some critics later argued that the women unconsciously performed the roles they were given, that they learned, through repetition and suggestion, how hysteria was supposed to look. Whether neurological or psychological, the diagnosis carried consequences. Women could be institutionalized for it, confined for it, dismissed because of it. Meanwhile, across Europe, another physician was watching. Sigmund Freud began his career studying hysteria. Initially influenced by Charcot, Freud later proposed that hysterical symptoms arose from repressed psychological trauma, often sexual in nature. Freud's theory was revolutionary in one sense. It shifted hysteria away from anatomy entirely. No more wandering womb, no more unstable uterus. Instead, the conflict was internal, buried memory, suppressed desire, unresolved shock. But here is the uncomfortable continuity. The condition was still seen as predominantly female. Even as hysteria entered the realm of psychoanalysis, it retained centuries of gendered association. Emotional intensity, bodily expression of stress. Dissociation, these were still culturally coded as feminine traits. And while male patients were certainly treated for nervous disorders, the stereotype of the hysterical woman became deeply embedded in Western culture. The fainting Victorian lady, the overly emotional wife, the unstable mother. Medicine did not invent these images alone, but it legitimized them. It gave them clinical authority. What's striking is how durable the narrative proved to be. Even as the scientific understanding of anatomy, neurology, and psychology advanced, echoes of the wandering womb lingered in language. The word hysteria itself, rooted in the Greek hystera, remained in use well into the 20th century. It wasn't officially removed from the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic manual until 1980. Nearly 2,000 years after ancient physicians imagined the uterus drifting upward, its linguistic shadow persisted. But beneath the diagnosis, something more complex was happening. Many women labeled hysterical were likely experiencing what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, epilepsy, panic disorder, depression, autoimmune disease, hormonal imbalance, chronic pain syndromes in a world that lacked adequate language for female distress, or perhaps lacked willingness to listen. Hysteria became a container for the unexplained. It was a diagnosis of ambiguity, and ambiguity is uncomfortable. Throughout history, when society has not understood women's suffering, it has often defaulted to biology, too emotional, too sensitive, too unstable, too governed by the body. The wandering womb may have died as literal anatomy, but the underlying suspicion remained. that women's bodies are unreliable narrators of their own experience. In the next part, we'll step back from hospitals and lecture halls and examine something broader: how this ancient myth shaped laws, education, and the limits placed on women's autonomy for centuries. By the time hysteria began fading from medical textbooks in the 20th century, the damage had already been done. For nearly 2 millennia, Western thought had circulated a powerful idea: a woman's body could betray her, not metaphorically, physically, emotionally, intellectually. The wandering womb was never just about anatomy. It was about authority. If women were governed by unstable internal forces, then perhaps they should not govern cities, or universities, or churches, or courts. The logic did not need to be stated outright. It seeped into law and custom quietly, like groundwater. In ancient Athens, women were excluded from political life. In Rome, their legal rights were limited. In medieval Europe, education for women was rare outside convents. During the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, philosophers still debated whether women possessed equal rational capacity. And beneath those debates lingered old assumptions about physiology. If a woman's emotions were tied to a restless organ, if her body fluctuated unpredictably, if her health depended on male supervision, then perhaps public power was too heavy a burden. Even in the 19th century, as universities expanded, many physicians argued that higher education could damage women's reproductive systems. The claim was not about wandering wombs anymore. It was about energy. The brain and the uterus, some doctors insisted, competed for vital resources. Too much intellectual exertion could supposedly shrink reproductive capacity. Ambition became a medical risk. This was not fringe thinking. It appeared in respected journals and lectures. The belief that female biology imposed natural limits shaped educational policy across Europe and North America. Again, the organ changed. The assumption remained. Even in the 20th century, women reporting chronic pain were more likely to be dismissed as anxious or psychosomatic. Heart disease symptoms in women were under-researched for decades, because clinical studies disproportionately focused on male bodies as the default. The male body became the neutral template. The female body became the variation. The wandering womb had once explained suffocation and fainting. Later, hysteria explained emotion and rebellion. In modern times, the pattern sometimes persists in subtler forms: misdiagnosis, delayed diagnosis, disbelief. History rarely vanishes. It echoes. But something else must be said here, something uncomfortable in a different way. Ancient physicians were not cartoon villains. Hippocrates was not inventing cruelty. He was working within the best explanatory framework available to him. Aristotle was building a metaphysical system that attempted to make sense of observed difference. They were wrong, but they were not irrational within their context. The tragedy is not that ancient people misunderstood anatomy. The tragedy is how easily anatomical misunderstanding fused with social hierarchy, and how durable that fusion became. Because once a belief about the body justifies inequality, it acquires extraordinary staying power. To challenge it requires more than scientific correction. It requires cultural change. When Renaissance anatomists like Andreas Vesalius disproved aspects of ancient physiology, they corrected diagrams. But diagrams do not immediately undo prejudice. When hysteria was removed from psychiatric manuals in 1980, the word disappeared from formal diagnosis. But stereotypes do not evaporate with terminology. The wandering womb began as a theory of motion. It became a theory of instability, then a theory of emotional weakness, then a cultural shorthand. And even today, phrases like overreacting, too hormonal, or overly sensitive echo faintly with that ancient suspicion that female experience is biologically distorted, not fully trustworthy, not entirely rational. History does not move in straight lines, but it leaves patterns. In the final part, we'll step back one last time and ask a deeper question. Why do myths about the body survive so long, even after evidence contradicts them? And what does the wandering womb reveal about how societies construct truth itself? The wandering womb no longer appears in medical textbooks. No physician today believes that the uterus drifts upward toward the lungs, choking women from within. Anatomy is mapped. Ligaments are named. Imaging technology sees through flesh with clinical precision. The organ has been fixed in place. And yet, the story refuses to disappear. Because the wandering womb was never just an anatomical mistake. It was a narrative about difference. Human beings do not simply observe bodies. We interpret them. We build stories around what we do not understand. And when those stories align with existing power structures, they harden into doctrine. For nearly 2,000 years, a theory about a mobile organ shaped the way half the population was perceived. It influenced treatment. It influenced education. It influenced who was believed and who was dismissed. The theory survived not because it was proven, but because it was useful. It explained female distress without questioning social conditions. It framed suffering as internal malfunction rather than external pressure. It placed responsibility inside the body instead of outside it. And that is a powerful move. When pain is internalized, systems remain intact. This pattern is not unique to women. Throughout history, dominant groups have often medicalized the behaviors of those with less power. Enslaved people were once diagnosed with drapetomania, a supposed mental illness that caused them to flee captivity. Homosexuality was classified as a psychiatric disorder until the late 20th century. Medicine, like all human institutions, reflects the culture that produces it. The wandering womb reveals something fundamental about knowledge itself. Facts do not exist in isolation. They are filtered through belief. Ancient physicians observed real symptoms: fainting, anxiety, seizures, breathlessness. Those symptoms demanded explanation. Within their worldview of humors, balance, and elemental motion, uterine migration felt coherent. When the worldview shifted, the explanation shifted, but the symptoms remained, which raises a difficult question. How many of our current medical assumptions will look strange centuries from now? Which diagnoses will future generations see as cultural artifacts rather than objective truth? The story of the wandering womb is not an invitation to distrust medicine. Modern science is built on systematic testing, peer review, evidence, revision. It corrects itself in ways ancient systems could not. But it is a reminder. Certainty should be held carefully, especially when it aligns too neatly with social hierarchy. Today, research into women's health is expanding rapidly. Hormonal cycles are studied in greater depth. Chronic pain conditions disproportionately affecting women are being taken more seriously. Clinical trials are increasingly required to include female participants. Progress is real. And yet, many women still report feeling dismissed in clinical settings. Studies have shown that women's reports of pain are sometimes taken less seriously than men's. Cardiac symptoms in women can present differently than the classic male model, long taught in textbooks, leading to delayed recognition. These are not relics of ancient Greece. They are contemporary echoes. The wandering womb survives not as anatomy, but as memory, a historical lesson about how easily biology can be weaponized by assumption. If you look back far enough, you can see the arc clearly. First, the womb wandered. Then women were unstable. Then women were hysterical. Then women were overly emotional. Each step sounded slightly more modern, slightly more scientific, slightly more refined. But beneath the language, the structure persisted. The idea that female experience is somehow less anchored, less rational, less reliable. And yet, the most striking part of this story is not the error. It is the entrance of the women who lived through it. Women who are treated with smoke and sent to coax imaginary organs back into place. Women who were institutionalized for hysteria. Women who were told education would destroy their reproductive systems. Women who navigated worlds that insisted their bodies were suspect. The wandering womb tells us less about female biology and more about human psychology. When we do not understand suffering, we reach for stories. When those stories confirm what we already believe, we cling to them. And when authority repeats them for centuries, they begin to feel like truth. The uterus never wandered, but ideas do. They travel across generations, across empires, across textbooks, sometimes unnoticed. The question is not whether myths will form. They always do. The question is how quickly we are willing to let them go.